Have you ever wondered, why does someone who performs miracles fall into depression? Elijah had just demonstrated God's power on Mount Carmel, but the next day he wanted to die. Tonight, we'll listen to the story of the collapse that followed victory, and this deep story that reminds us that prophets are human too. As you settle in tonight, imagine standing on a mountaintop where the impossible has just happened. The air still crackles with the memory of divine fire, the ground is wet with the first rain in 3 years, and everywhere you look, there are signs that God has just performed one of the most spectacular miracles in human history. This is Mount Carmel, and you are witnessing the aftermath of one of the greatest spiritual victories ever recorded. Elijah, the prophet of God, has just called down fire from heaven, defeated 450 false prophets, and ended a devastating drought. The people are shouting, "The Lord, He is God." The victory is complete, overwhelming, undeniable. But if you could see into the heart of the man at the center of this triumph, you would discover something surprising and deeply human. Despite the miraculous victory, despite the clear demonstration of God's power, despite the vindication of everything he has stood for, Elijah is not celebrating. He is not basking in the glory of God's triumph. Instead, something is stirring in his heart that will, within hours, send him fleeing into the wilderness like a fugitive. Tonight, we're going to explore one of the most psychologically complex and emotionally honest stories in the entire Bible, the story of how God's mightiest prophet went from the heights of spiritual victory to the depths of despair in less than 24 hours. This isn't just an ancient tale of a man having a bad day. This is a profound exploration of human psychology, spiritual warfare, and the way God deals with his servants when they reach their breaking point. Come with me into the heart and mind of a man who had seen God's power demonstrated in the most dramatic ways, yet found himself overwhelmed by fear, exhaustion, and the crushing weight of standing alone against an entire culture that had rejected God. To understand Elijah's collapse, we must first understand the magnitude of what had just happened on Mount Carmel. For 3.5 years, Israel had suffered under a devastating drought. Elijah stood alone against 450 prophets of Baal in a winner-take-all confrontation to prove which God was real. The test was simple: whichever deity could send fire from heaven to consume a sacrifice would be acknowledged as the true God. The prophets of Baal prayed, shouted, danced, and cut themselves until their blood flowed, but their God remained silent. Then Elijah stepped forward. He rebuilt the altar of the Lord, arranged the wood and sacrifice, then had it doused with water 3 times until water filled the trench around it. When Elijah prayed, the response was immediate and overwhelming. Fire fell from heaven and consumed not only the sacrifice and wood, but also the stones and soil, and even licked up the water. When the people saw this, they fell prostrate and cried, "The Lord, He is God." The victory was complete. The false prophets were executed, the drought was about to end, and it seemed Israel would finally turn back to God. Elijah had been vindicated in the most spectacular way possible. Yet within hours, this victorious prophet would be running for his life, overwhelmed by despair. The catalyst for Elijah's dramatic collapse came from Queen Jezebel's message: "May the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely, if by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like that of one of them," meaning like the dead prophets of Baal. From a logical standpoint, this threat shouldn't have terrified Elijah. He had just seen God demonstrate his power dramatically. If God could send fire from heaven, surely he could protect his prophet from one angry queen. But Jezebel's threat hit Elijah at a moment of particular vulnerability. The Mount Carmel confrontation had been emotionally and spiritually overwhelming. Elijah had poured everything into that moment, and now he was experiencing what we might recognize as severe burnout. Jezebel represented something beyond personal animosity. She embodied the spiritual darkness that had engulfed Israel. Her threat may have triggered a devastating realization: even after such a clear demonstration of God's power, nothing had really changed. She was still in power, still determined to destroy God's servants, still promoting idol worship. The people might have acknowledged God's power in a moment of awe, but would they really turn back to him, or would they return to idolatry once the excitement wore off? This thought may have crushed Elijah's spirit completely. When Elijah received Jezebel's message, something broke inside him. The Bible tells us, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. But this conceals a psychological collapse of staggering proportions. The man who had stood fearlessly before kings suddenly found himself overwhelmed by terror. This was what modern psychology would recognize as a severe anxiety disorder, possibly a panic attack. The overwhelming fear, desperate need to escape, physical flight response, and later desire to die, all point to a man whose nervous system had been pushed beyond its limits. Several factors contributed to this collapse. First, there was sheer physical and emotional exhaustion from years of operating under extreme stress. The Mount Carmel confrontation had been the climax, and now his adrenaline crashed. Second, there was psychological isolation. Elijah had been alone in his stand for God, feeling like the only faithful prophet left. This spiritual loneliness was devastating. Third, there was post-victory depression. After such dramatic vindication, Elijah may have expected to feel triumphant. Instead, he discovered that victory didn't solve all problems. The anticlimax was crushing. Finally, there was spiritual warfare. Satan had failed to prevent God's victory on Mount Carmel, but he could still attack God's servant through fear and despair. The result was complete flight. Elijah abandoned everything and ran, from Jezebel, from his responsibilities, from his calling, from life itself. Elijah's flight took him to Beersheba, then into the wilderness beyond, a harsh, desolate region where few survive. This wilderness was both a geographical location and a spiritual metaphor for Elijah's internal state. Just as the landscape was barren and lifeless, so Elijah's soul had become a wasteland of despair and fear. After walking for a day into the desert, Elijah collapsed under a broom tree. This wasn't a spiritual retreat. This was the desperate flight of a man who no longer wanted to live. The scraggly desert shrub offered minimal shade and no comfort, fitting for where Elijah found himself, alone, exposed, barely surviving. Under this tree, Elijah made a request that reveals his despair. I have had enough, Lord. Take my life, I am no better than my ancestors. This wasn't momentary frustration, this was the cry of a man who had reached the absolute end of his resources. I have had enough, carried the weight of years of struggle and spiritual warfare. Elijah couldn't take another step, face another challenge, endure another day of standing alone against the forces arrayed against God. His statement, I am no better than my ancestors, revealed another layer of despair. In his exhausted state, he couldn't see that his Mount Carmel achievement was unprecedented. Instead, he felt like a failure who had accomplished nothing lasting. This is common in severe depression. The inability to see one's own worth or accomplishments. Elijah's perspective had become so distorted that he could no longer remember God's faithfulness or his own significance in God's plan. God's response to Elijah's suicidal despair was not judgment or rebuke, but tender care. First, God provided rest. As Elijah lay under the tree, overwhelmed by exhaustion, he fell asleep, the collapse of a nervous system pushed beyond its limits. Then God sent an angel who touched him gently and said, Get up and eat. Nearby was bread and water, simple food, exactly what Elijah needed. The angel didn't lecture about faith, he provided practical care. This pattern repeated. After eating, Elijah slept again. The angel returned, Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you. God was acknowledging that what Elijah faced was indeed overwhelming. This wasn't weakness or lack of faith, it was human limitation. Strengthened by this divine provision, Elijah traveled 40 days and nights to Mount Horeb. The same man who had collapsed wanting to die was now able to undertake a journey of hundreds of miles. This transformation wasn't overnight, it was the fruit of God's patient, practical care. The 40-day journey was more than transportation, it was therapy. During those weeks, sustained by miraculous food, Elijah had time to process his trauma and begin healing. The number 40 represents testing, preparation, and transformation. For Elijah, these days represented a journey from despair back toward hope. The destination was significant too. Mount Horeb was the mountain of God, where Moses had received the law and encountered God. By leading Elijah there, God was taking him back to the foundations of faith, back to the source of divine revelation. At Mount Horeb, Elijah found a cave and spent the night. When the word of the Lord came to him, God asked, What are you doing here, Elijah? This wasn't condemnation, but gentle concern. A father trying to understand his troubled child. Elijah's response revealed his anguish, I have been very zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, and put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they are trying to kill me too. We hear the cry of a man feeling completely alone and defeated, I've given everything for you, yet they're still rejecting you, I'm still in danger, and I'm the only one who cares. God's response, Go out and stand on the mountain in the presence of the Lord, for the Lord is about to pass by. As Elijah stood on the mountain, he experienced dramatic phenomena, a powerful wind that tore mountains apart, an earthquake that shook the foundations, and fire. But, the Lord was not in the wind, the Lord was not in the earthquake, and, the Lord was not in the fire. After the fire came a gentle whisper, a still small voice. And it was in this whisper that God's presence was found. This revelation was profoundly significant for Elijah's healing. Perhaps he had begun to think God only worked through spectacular miracles, that divine presence required overwhelming displays of power. But God was teaching him that his preferred mode of communication was often quiet, gentle, intimate. When Elijah heard the whisper, he wrapped his face and went to the cave mouth, recognizing God's presence even in this quiet manifestation. He was learning that divine presence wasn't measured by volume but by the quality of holy love that transforms hearts. When God spoke from the gentle whisper, he asked the same question, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" Elijah gave the same response, showing his feelings hadn't magically disappeared. He was still hurting, still feeling alone. But this time, God gave specific instructions: anoint Hazael as king over Aram, anoint Jehu as king over Israel, and anoint Elisha as prophet to succeed him. These instructions contained important messages for Elijah's healing. First, they confirmed his ministry wasn't over, God still had work for him, still valued his service. Second, they revealed God was working on a larger scale than Elijah could see. The changes would come through multiple leaders over time. Most importantly, God told Elijah about Elisha, his successor and companion. This addressed his sense of being alone. Not only was he not the only faithful person, but God was preparing someone to work alongside him. God also corrected Elijah's mistaken belief, "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal." 7,000 faithful people. Elijah was not alone at all. This revelation was crucial for emotional healing. The crushing weight of feeling like he carried the entire burden of faithfulness was lifted. He was part of a community of faith, even if not visible to him daily. Elijah's healing involved several key elements. God addressed physical needs first, gave time and space to process, listened without judgment, revealed himself in a new way, corrected mistaken perceptions gently, and provided renewed purpose and companionship. By the end, Elijah was restored to effective ministry, serving faithfully for years more alongside Elisha. His story didn't end in the cave, it was renewed there. King over Aram, anoint Jehu as king over Israel, and anoint Elisha as prophet to succeed him. These instructions contained several important messages for Elijah's healing and restoration. First, they confirmed that his ministry was not over. God still had work for him to do, still valued his service, still had confidence in his ability to carry out divine purposes. The sense of being useless or finished was not accurate. Second, the instructions revealed that God was working on a larger scale than Elijah could see. The changes that the prophet longed to see in Israel would come, but through a complex process involving multiple leaders over time. God's plan was bigger and more long-term than Elijah had imagined. Third, and perhaps most importantly, God told Elijah about Elisha, his successor and, as it would turn out, his companion. This addressed directly Elijah's sense of being alone in his ministry. Not only was he not the only faithful person left in Israel, but God was preparing someone to work alongside him and eventually to continue his work. God also corrected Elijah's mistaken belief that he was the only faithful person left, "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal and whose mouths have not kissed him." 7,000 faithful people. Elijah was not alone at all. His sense of isolation was based on limited perspective, not on reality. This revelation was crucial for Elijah's emotional healing. The crushing weight of feeling like he was carrying the entire burden of faithfulness in Israel was lifted from his shoulders. He was part of a community of faith, even if that community was not visible to him in his daily experience. As you rest tonight, remember that the God who met Elijah in his moment of greatest weakness is the same God who is with you in yours. Whether you're dealing with burnout, depression, anxiety, or overwhelming pressures, you are not alone, and your struggle is not spiritual failure. Sometimes our greatest victories can be followed by our deepest valleys, not because we've done something wrong, but because human beings have limits and need time to recover from intense experiences. The God who calls us to serve him also provides for our rest, healing, and restoration. If you're feeling isolated in your struggles, remember that there are others who share your faith, even if you can't see them. If you're feeling like your efforts are futile, remember that God's plan is bigger and longer term than what we can see from our limited perspective. Tonight, listen for the still small voice that speaks not in the wind of dramatic experiences or the earthquake of life-changing events or the fire of spectacular successes, but in the gentle whisper of divine love that says, "You are seen, you are valued, and your story is not over." Rest in the knowledge that the same God who provided bread and water for Elijah in the wilderness is providing for your needs today. The same God who gave the weary prophet rest and time to heal is offering you the same gifts. The same God who renewed Elijah's purpose and provided him with a companion is working in your life to bring restoration and hope. Your breaking point is not your ending point. Your moment of weakness is not your final word. Like Elijah, you can find healing, renewal, and purpose even after the darkest valley. Trust the process, accept the care that God provides, and know that the still small voice is always speaking words of love over your life. Sleep peacefully tonight, knowing that you are held by the God who understands your struggles, provides for your needs, and has a future full of hope prepared for you. Good night, and may you rest knowing that God meets you in your weakness with endless love and patient care. Asterisk.